By sunset, the whole town would remember the price placed on Clara Whitaker's head, but the man who arrived too late to stop the auction would make them remember something else, the moment a mother and child stopped being property. The wind came hard down Redemption Creek's main street that afternoon, dragging dust beneath the wheels of wagons and rattling the loose signs above the mercantile, the bank, and the saloon. It was Montana Territory, 1878, the kind of dry summer day when even decent people kept their eyes lowered because looking too closely at suffering made a person responsible for it. Clara stood on the raised wooden auction block in a faded calico dress that had been let out twice at the waist and still pulled tight when she breathed too deeply. Her soft, chubby face was pale beneath a film of dust, her auburn hair tucked under a simple bonnet that had lost one ribbon, and in her arms slept 8-month-old Sammy, wrapped in the last good blanket she owned. One of his tiny hands clutched the front of her dress as though he understood, in some wordless infant way, that the world beneath him had become unsafe. Clara kept one palm over the back of his head, shielding him from the stairs, from the sun, from the shame men had decided should belong to her. Silas Hargrove, banker, creditor, and the closest thing Redemption Creek had to a man who could turn ink into chains, stood beside her with a ledger under one arm and a polished cane in his hand. "Debt does not die with a husband," he announced, his voice carrying over the crowd. Mrs. Whitaker's late husband left obligations unpaid, and since the property has already been seized, her labor contract, along with care of the child, will be transferred to the highest responsible bidder. Clara felt the words slide over her like cold water. Labor contract. Transfer. Obligations. Men always found clean words for dirty things. A few women near the dry goods store turned away, their gloved hands pressed to their mouths. No one stepped forward. No one objected. Clara had learned that silence could be louder than cruelty when enough people shared it. Otis Bell, a thick-necked rancher with a silver watch chain, stretched across his vest, lifted 2 fingers. $30, he called. A murmur moved through the crowd. Silas tapped his cane once, pleased. $30 from Mr. Bell. A practical woman, gentleman. Strong arms, healthy build, accustomed to hardship, and the boy will be useful once he's grown. Clara's fingers tightened around Sammy's blanket until her knuckles ached. She would not cry. Not here. Not for them. Sammy stirred, his small mouth trembling before he settled again against her shoulder, warm and trusting. She bent her cheek to his hair and whispered, "I've got you, sweetheart," though she no longer knew if that was true. Another man bid 40. Otis raised it to 50. Silas smiled as if the afternoon had become a church picnic. The dust thickened, blurring the far end of the street, and Clara stared past the crowd toward the open road beyond town. There was no rescue coming from that road. Her father was gone. Her husband was buried. The law stood 10 feet away, pretending not to understand what was happening. Silas raised his cane. Going once. Clara lifted her chin because it was the only thing left that belonged to her. Going twice. The baby woke and gave a soft, frightened cry. Then, from the dust at the end of the street, a single gold coin struck the auction table with a sharp sound that cut through every whisper. The crowd turned. A tall cowboy in a worn brown Stetson stepped out of the haze, his dark blue shirt powdered with trail dust, his face sun-browned and unreadable beneath the brim. He did not rush. He did not shout. He walked as if the street itself had gone quiet to make room for him. His eyes moved once to Clara, then to the child in her arms, and something in his jaw tightened without changing the calm of his voice. "Count it again," he said to Silas Hargrove. "Then count her freedom." For one suspended moment, no one in Redemption Creek seemed willing to breathe. The gold coin on the auction table flashed in the late sun, bright and hard against the scarred wood, while Silas Hargrove stared at it as if it had fallen from the sky instead of from the hand of the dust-covered cowboy now standing before him. Clara did not know the man. She knew only the shape of him through the haze, tall and broad-shouldered, his worn Stetson pulled low, his coat hanging open over a dark blue shirt faded by weather and work. He carried himself with the stillness of someone who did not need to prove he was dangerous, and that frightened her almost as much as it steadied her. Men who spoke softly often expected the world to lean closer. This one made the world step back. Silas recovered first, smoothing a hand over the front of his vest. "This is a lawful proceeding, Mr. Mercer," he said, and Clara heard surprise move through the crowd at the name. Caleb Mercer. Even she had heard it whispered in town, always with a mixture of respect and caution. A rancher from 12 miles west. A man who kept to himself. A man who paid his debts and did not drink away his temper in public. Caleb did not look at Silas for long. His gaze returned to the ledger tucked under the banker's arm. "Then you will have no trouble naming the lawful amount." Silas gave a thin smile. "The debt stands at $74, plus handling, public notice, court filing, and transfer expenses." Caleb reached into the inside pocket of his coat and drew out a small leather pouch. He loosened the cord with one hand and poured coins onto the table, slow enough that each one landed with a clean, final sound. $100. The crowd murmured. Otis Bell took one step forward, his face darkening. "Now hold on. I had the standing bid." Caleb turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. "You had a bid on a debt. I am paying it." "You are buying what is on that block," Otis said. Clara felt Sammy startle in her arms at the harshness of his voice. She pressed her lips to the baby's temple and forced herself not to look away. Caleb's jaw moved once, as if he were holding back words that would only make the afternoon uglier. "No," he said. "I am ending what is on that block." Silas lifted his cane and tapped the table, trying to reclaim the attention. "Mr. Mercer, sentiment does not erase documentation. Once payment is accepted, the transfer of obligation must be signed over to the purchaser." "Show me the paper." Silas hesitated. That hesitation was small, hardly more than a blink, but Clara saw it. So did Caleb. The banker opened the ledger, removed a folded contract, and held it just beyond Caleb's reach. Standard language. Caleb extended his hand. "If my money is good enough to settle it, my eyes are good enough to read it." A few men in the crowd shifted their boots in the dust. Someone coughed near the livery. Silas's smile tightened, but he handed over the paper. Caleb unfolded it with deliberate care. Clara watched his eyes move down the page. He did not rush. The longer he read, the colder his expression became. Not loud, not wild. Cold, like the shadow inside a well. "This says the mother's labor may be assigned until the debt is satisfied," Caleb said. "The debt is now satisfied." Silas lifted his chin. "There are additional clauses. This says the child's future labor may be claimed by the holder of the note." A silence spread outward from the platform. Clara felt the blood leave her face. She had known they meant to take everything from her, but seeing Sammy turned into words on paper made the world tilt beneath her feet. Caleb looked up then, not at Silas, not at Otis, but at Clara. His eyes were steady, brown beneath the brim of his hat, and for the first time that afternoon she saw anger in them. Not anger that reached for her. Anger that stood between her and the thing trying to swallow her. He folded the paper once, then tore it in half. Silas jerked forward. "You have no authority to destroy that document." Caleb tore it again. Then again. The sound of ripping paper carried down the street clearer than any church bell. Pieces of the contract slipped from his fingers and scattered across the auction table, thin white scraps trembling in the dusty wind. "I have the authority of a paid debt," Caleb said. "And the good sense to know a baby does not owe labor to any man." Otis scoffed. "You think tearing paper changes what she is?" Caleb stepped down from the edge of the platform and turned fully toward him. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the revolver at his hip. Somehow that made every man nearby stand more carefully. "I know exactly what she is," Caleb said. "She is a mother. He is her son. And no one owns them now." The words moved through Clara before she understood them. No one owns them now. Not Silas. Not Otis. Not even the man who had paid enough money to take them away. Sammy whimpered, and Clara rocked him with hands that had begun to tremble. She hated the trembling. She hated that relief could feel so much like fear. Silas gathered the coins with stiff fingers, his face pale with fury he was too careful to show. You may regret interfering in matters you do not understand, Mr. Mercer. Caleb put his hat back on. I understand enough. Then he climbed the 2 steps to the platform, stopping several feet away from Clara so she did not have to shrink from him. Up close, she saw the dust on his sleeves, the weathered lines beside his eyes, the restraint in the way his hands remained visible and empty. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, his voice gentler than it had been a moment before. You and your boy can step down whenever you are ready. Clara stared at him. The crowd was still watching. The same people who had watched her be priced now watched her be released, and somehow that felt almost as unbearable. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to run. She wanted to sit down in the dust and hold Sammy until the sky went dark. Instead, she lifted her chin, because that was still hers, and asked the only question that mattered. Men do not pay that much for nothing. What are you hiding? A faint shadow crossed Caleb Mercer's face, not shame, not anger, but something older. He looked toward the torn scraps of paper on the table, then back to her. Enough to know what a cage looks like, he said. And enough to know I will not build another one around you. Clara did not step down from the auction block because she trusted Caleb Mercer. She stepped down because Sammy had begun to cry, and a crying baby made a crowd lean closer in ways she could not bear. Caleb moved first, but only to clear a path. He did not touch her elbow. He did not reach for the child. He simply turned his broad shoulders toward the street and let the people of Redemption Creek part around him as if shame had finally found a shape and walked among them. Clara followed with Sammy tucked high against her chest, her small valise hanging from one hand, its worn leather handle biting into her palm. Behind her, Silas Hargrove gathered his coins with the careful patience of a man who had lost the afternoon but not the war. Otis Bell stood near the hitching rail, his mouth curled with a promise. He did not speak. Clara felt both men watching the back of her neck as she crossed the dusty street, and every step away from the auction table felt less like freedom than like walking across thin ice. The boarding house stood 2 doors past the Mercantile, a narrow white building with peeling paint, lace curtains, and a porch that sagged toward the road. Mrs. Evelyn Pike, the widow who owned it, opened the door before Caleb knocked. Her gray eyes moved from Caleb to Clara, then to the baby's flushed face, and whatever question she had been ready to ask died quietly behind her lips. One room, Caleb said, placing money on the small table by the door. For Mrs. Whitaker and her son. Mrs. Pike glanced toward the staircase. Only the back room is empty. That will do. Clara waited for him to ask for a second room, or to announce that he would be staying nearby, or to make some claim now that no crowd stood between them. He did none of those things. He carried her valise up the stairs, set it outside the back room, and stepped away before she could accuse him of expecting gratitude. The room was plain, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small oil lamp, and a window looking toward the alley. To Clara, it might as well have been a courthouse cell. For walls could protect a woman or trap her, and she had not yet learned which kind this was. Caleb stood in the hall, hat in one hand, his eyes lowered enough to give her space, but not so far that he seemed careless. Mrs. Pike will bring hot water, he said. There is a doctor 3 streets over if the boy needs seeing. Clara shifted Sammy from one aching arm to the other. And where will you be? Downstairs for a while. Then outside if I am needed. Needed by whom? Her voice was sharper than she meant it to be, but fear had edges, and hers had been scraped raw in front of half the town. Caleb accepted the cut without flinching. By you if you call. By no one if you do not. She looked at his hands. Big hands, work-roughened, empty. You expect me to sleep with you outside my door and call that kindness? No, he said. I expect you to lock the door. Clara stared at him. He reached slowly into his vest pocket, took out the room key Mrs. Pike had given him, and placed it on the floorboards between them rather than stepping close enough to hand it to her. You decide who comes in. Then he turned and walked down the hall. Clara waited until his boots faded on the stairs before she snatched up the key, carried Sammy inside, and closed the door with her shoulder. She locked it once, then slid the wooden chair beneath the knob and pushed the washstand in front of the chair until her breath came short. Only then did she sit on the edge of the bed. Sammy fussed against her, his cheeks warm, his tiny fists opening and closing in the air. "I know," she whispered, rocking him. "I know, my love." Outside, the town moved on. Wagon wheels rolled. Men laughed too loudly near the saloon. Somewhere a piano started and stopped. Clara unpinned her bonnet with shaking fingers and set it beside the lamp. Her hair slipped loose around her face, and for the first time all day, there was no one in the room to see whether she broke. She did not cry. She washed Sammy's face, gave him what milk she had left, and laid him beside her on the bed with one hand resting on his back. The room grew dim. The oil lamp threw a small amber circle across the quilt. Every creak of the hallway tightened her shoulders. Every muffled footstep made her look toward the chair under the knob. Near midnight, Sammy woke with a thin, unhappy sound, hotter now, his breath uneven from the long day and the dust. Clara sat up at once, her heart climbing into her throat. She had no money for a doctor. Caleb's money had bought freedom, not trust, and she hated needing anything more from him. She pressed a damp cloth to Sammy's forehead, humming the old hymn her mother used to hum, but the baby kept whimpering, turning his face against her dress. A soft knock came at the door. Clara froze. "Mrs. Whitaker," Caleb's voice said from the hallway, low enough not to carry. "I heard the boy." Clara did not answer. Her hand closed around the brass candlestick on the table, though she knew it would do little against a man of his size. A pause followed. Then something was set gently on the floor outside her door. Mrs. Pike had fever drops. "There is warm water, clean cloth, and goat's milk. I will be at the stairs." His boots moved away. Not close. Away. Clara waited until silence settled again before she moved the washstand, shifted the chair, unlocked the door a finger's width, and looked out. A small tray sat on the floor. A brown bottle, folded linen, a covered cup, and a note written in a steady hand. "For the child. Use only 3 drops. Dr. Miller can come at first light if you wish it." She looked down the hall. Caleb sat on the top step with his back against the wall, hat resting on one knee, revolver placed on the floor beside him but untouched. He was not facing her door. He was facing the stairs, as though the danger he expected would come from below, not from within the room. Clara took the tray and shut the door without speaking. By dawn, Sammy's fever had eased. Pale light slipped through the curtains, turning the room gray and soft. Clara moved the washstand again and opened the door. Caleb was still there, asleep sitting up, his chin lowered, one hand loose near his hat, the lines of his face roughened by exhaustion. He had kept watch all night and asked for nothing. Clara stood barefoot in the doorway, Sammy warm and quiet against her shoulder, and studied the man who had paid $100 to set her free, then spent the night outside a locked door to prove he would not cross it. When his eyes opened, he did not startle. He simply looked at her, waiting. Clara looked at the revolver beside him, then back to his face. "Are you guarding me?" she asked softly, "or guarding yourself from what you might become?" Caleb's expression changed so slightly most people would have missed it, but Clara saw the old wound pass behind his eyes. "Both, maybe," he said. "A man ought to know the difference between protecting a door and owning what is behind it." By mid-morning, the fever had left Sammy's cheeks, but the strain of the night had settled deep into Clara's bones. Mrs. Pike sent up biscuits wrapped in a napkin and a small jar of apple butter, pretending not to notice the chair still braced near the door. Caleb waited downstairs until Clara came down with Sammy bundled against her shoulder and her valise in her free hand. He had already brought the wagon around to the side street where fewer people could stare. 2 brown horses stood hitched beneath a sky washed clean by thin morning light, and in the wagon bed lay folded blankets, a sack of flour, a crate of canned peaches, a tin of coffee, a small bundle of clean cloths, and a stoppered bottle of goat's milk packed carefully in straw. Clara paused at the sight of it all. No man had ever prepared for her comfort without making certain she knew the cost of it. Caleb saw her looking and lifted one shoulder. "The trail is 12 miles. Longer if the South Wash is muddy. Babies do not care much for a man's schedule." She wanted not to smile. It almost happened anyway, small and uncertain, before she tucked it away. "You know a great deal about babies for a man who slept sitting on stairs." "I know enough to be afraid of them," he said, and the honesty of it caught her off guard. He helped Mrs. Pike tie Clara's valise to the side rail, then stepped back from the wagon seat. "You can sit up front if you want the smoother ride. You can sit in the back if you would rather have distance. I will not take offense either way." Clara looked at the front bench, then the wagon bed, then at the street where a few townspeople had begun to slow their steps and pretend they were not watching. Pride wanted the back. Exhaustion wanted the front. Sammy stirred and pressed his warm face beneath her chin. "The front," she said quietly. "For him." Caleb nodded as if she had made no larger confession than choosing coffee over tea. He set a small wooden step beside the wagon, then turned away enough to give her room to climb up without his hands at her waist. The courtesy was so simple that it made her throat tighten. Once she was seated, he gathered the reins and guided the team out of Redemption Creek without looking toward the bank, though Clara could not stop herself from glancing back. Silas Hargrove stood in the doorway, one hand curled around his cane, his face unreadable from the distance. Otis Bell leaned against a post outside the saloon, watching the wagon roll away with the lazy patience of a man who believed all roads eventually bent back toward him. Clara faced forward and held Sammy closer. The town fell behind them, its false front buildings shrinking into boards and dust, until the only sounds were the creak of wheels, the soft clink of harness, and the wind moving through dry grass. The road west crossed open prairie broken by sagebrush, low hills, and cottonwoods leaning along a creek bed nearly dry from summer heat. Caleb drove with steady hands. He did not fill the silence with questions. That silence should have felt awkward, but after the shouting of the auction and the whispers at the boarding house, Clara found it almost merciful. After 3 miles, Sammy began to fuss. She shifted him, bounced him, hummed, offered the milk, then apologized before she caught herself. "He is tired." Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "So are you." "I am used to it." "That does not make it right." The words were quiet, almost lost beneath the wagon wheels, but Clara heard them. She looked down at Sammy's tiny fingers twisting in the edge of her sleeve. "Right has not had much to do with my life lately, Mr. Mercer. Caleb is fine, if you want." She did not answer, and he did not ask again. A gust of wind swept across the trail, lifting dust in a pale sheet. Clara turned her body to shield Sammy. Caleb drew the wagon to a slower pace, shrugged out of his coat, and held it toward her by the collar, careful not to let his fingers brush hers. "For the dust." She hesitated. Accepting anything still felt like signing a paper she had not read. Then Sammy coughed softly, and she took it. The coat was heavy, warm from Caleb's shoulders, smelling faintly of leather, sun, and clean wool. She draped it around the baby first, then over her own arms. "Thank you." Caleb gave a small nod. "You are welcome." Near noon, they stopped beneath a cottonwood where a trickle of creek water still moved over smooth stones. Caleb watered the horses, spread a blanket in the shade, and set out biscuits, peaches, and a tin cup of coffee for Clara. He ate standing a few feet away until she looked at him. "You can sit," she said, surprised by her own voice. He lowered himself onto a flat stone, leaving a respectful stretch of grass between them. Sammy, now fully awake, stared at Caleb with solemn suspicion. Caleb stared back with equal uncertainty. Clara saw it then, the way this capable man who had faced down a town seemed entirely defeated by one round-cheeked baby. Sammy waved one damp fist. Caleb slowly lifted his hand in return, as if greeting a judge. The sound that escaped Clara was not quite a laugh, but it was close enough that both of them noticed. Caleb's eyes softened before he looked away. "That may be the first kind word he has offered me." That was not a word. Still the kindest thing I have heard from a Whitaker so far. Clara lowered her gaze, but this time it was to hide the warmth in her face rather than fear. By late afternoon, the land began to rise. The road narrowed between split rail fencing, and cattle grazed in the distance like dark stitches across the gold grass. At the top of a low hill, Caleb drew the horses to a stop. Below them sat Mercer Ranch, a weathered 2-story house with a deep wooden porch, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, a windmill turning slow above the well, and fields stretching toward a blue line of mountains. It was not grand. It was not polished. A shutter hung crooked on one upstairs window, and the front gate needed mending. But smoke curled from the chimney, and the yard was swept clean, and evening light lay across the roof like a blessing. "It is not much," Caleb said. Clara looked at the house, then at the open land, then at Sammy sleeping beneath the edge of Caleb's coat. After the auction block, after the locked room, after the road behind her had closed 1 mile at a time, the quiet of the place felt almost impossible. "It is standing," she said. Caleb looked at her then, as if he understood that she was not speaking only of the house. He clicked his tongue to the horses, and the wagon rolled down toward the porch where a gray-haired ranch hand stepped from the barn and lifted a hand in greeting. Clara noticed the house had 2 upper windows, but only one curtain moved in the wind. The other was dark, shut tight, its glass dull behind the fading sun. Caleb saw where she was looking, and for the first time all day, his calm seemed to draw inward. "That room stays locked," he said. Clara turned toward him. "Why?" His hands tightened once on the reins before easing again. "Because some doors are easier to guard than open." The first night at Mercer Ranch did not feel like safety. It felt like a room that had not yet decided whether it would hold Clara gently or close around her. Caleb gave her the larger upstairs bedroom, the one with the clean quilt, the washstand, and the window facing the pasture. He carried her valise only as far as the doorway, set it down, and stepped back before she could tense. "This room locks from the inside," he said, placing the key on the small table. "I will be in the bunkhouse if you need anything." Clara looked past him toward the shadowed hallway, where the locked room sat at the far end like a held breath. "And if I do not need anything, then I will not come." He spoke as if the answer was simple, as if men had not spent her life teaching her that a closed door was only a delay. When he left, Clara locked the door, then stood with her back against it until Sammy stirred in the middle of the bed. The baby's small face was peaceful in the lamplight, his lashes resting on cheeks still round with sleep, and the sight of him made her chest ache. "We are here for tonight," she whispered. "Only tonight, if we choose." The word choose sounded strange in her mouth. In the morning, habit woke her before sunrise. She fed Sammy, tied her hair beneath her bonnet, and went downstairs with the baby on one hip, careful not to make the floorboards complain. The kitchen was plain but orderly, with an iron stove, a long table, and a basket of potatoes near the pantry door. Clara found flour, salt, lard, and a crock of milk, and, before anyone else entered, she had biscuits in the oven and coffee boiling. Work steadied her. Work gave her hands something to do besides tremble. By the time Caleb came in from the yard, his sleeves rolled to the forearms and his hair damp from the well pump, the kitchen smelled of brown bread and hot coffee. He stopped in the doorway. Behind him stood the gray-haired ranch hand she had seen the evening before, along with 2 younger cowboys who looked as if they had not expected a woman in the house, much less one holding a baby and ruling the stove like she had been born beside it. Clara braced herself for comments, for pity, for the weighing look that always came before a person decided what a desperate woman owed. Caleb only removed his hat. "Morning, Mrs. Whitaker." The others copied him, hats coming off one by one. "This is Amos Reed, my foreman," Caleb said. "That is Ben Carter and Eli Shaw." Amos nodded with weathered kindness. "Ma'am." Clara lifted her chin. "Breakfast will be ready in 5 minutes." Caleb crossed the kitchen slowly, took the coffee pot from the stove before it boiled over, and lowered his voice so the others would not hear. "You do not have to cook to earn your room. I know how to cook." "That is not what I said." Clara turned, biscuit cloth in hand, and found him watching her with that quiet patience that made it hard to hide behind anger. "Then what did you say?" "I said you do not work here to earn safety. You are safe first." The words struck harder than any raised voice. Clara looked away before he could see how they landed. Safe first. Not useful first. Not grateful first. Not pretty enough, thin enough, obedient enough, quiet enough. Safe first. Sammy chose that moment to pat both hands against her shoulder and babble at Caleb as if the man had been invited into some private court. Caleb blinked, plainly uncertain what response was required, then coughed into his hand, failing to hide a grin. Clara felt the smallest looseness in her chest, not happiness exactly, but the first inch of a door opening. Over the next week, Mercer Ranch began to change in ways no one announced. Clara scrubbed the kitchen shelves, not because she had to, but because dust had settled so thick on the blue plates that they looked gray. She mended a tear in Amos's coat after finding it hung beside the door. She sorted the pantry, marked jars with neat slips of paper, and discovered that the sugar had been stored beside the lamp oil by a man with no fear of bad coffee. The cowboys learned to wipe their boots before entering after she gave them one look over Sammy's sleeping head. Caleb said little, but he noticed everything. He fixed the loose stair rail the morning after she gripped it too tightly. He lowered a shelf in the pantry after seeing her stretch for the flour. He brought a small cradle down from the attic, sanded the rough edge smooth, and left it by the fireplace without explanation. Clara found it after supper, when the house had quieted and the last light lay gold across the floorboards. "Where did this come from?" she asked. Caleb stood near the mantel, rolling his hat brim between his hands. It was in storage. It belonged to someone. His gaze moved toward the dark hallway upstairs. Yes. Clara understood then that the locked room was not empty. It was full of whatever Caleb could not bear to touch. She did not ask. Not yet. Instead, she laid Sammy in the cradle, and the baby reached one hand through the wooden slats toward Caleb. Caleb looked down at those tiny fingers as though they offered both blessing and judgment. He bent slowly and let Sammy curl a fist around his thumb. For a moment, the hard lines of his face softened into something almost painful to witness. Clara stood beside the fireplace, her hands folded against the front of her dress, and felt the ranch shift around them, no longer just boards, roof, and land, but a place where grief and hope sat at the same table. The next afternoon, rain threatened but did not fall. Clara found a stack of account books in the small office off the kitchen, piled beneath an old newspaper and a broken spur. She meant only to clear the desk. Then she saw Silas Hargrove's name written on the top page in black ink. Her fingers stilled. Caleb entered carrying a box of nails and stopped when he saw the open ledger. "Those are ranch accounts," he said. "I can put them away." Clara did not move. "They are not balanced." He looked at her more closely. "You read figures?" "My husband thought numbers were dull. That made it easier for me to learn them." Caleb set the nails down. "You do not have to trouble yourself with my books. I am already troubled by them." She turned the ledger toward him, pointing to a line where interest had been added twice under different names. "Silas charged you a late fee on a payment made 3 days early." Caleb's expression hardened, but he remained silent. Clara turned another page, then another, following the ink with growing unease. "This is not carelessness." He hid it in the columns. She looked up. "How long has he held paper on your ranch?" Caleb's eyes moved toward the window, toward the pasture and the barn and the land that had looked so steady beneath the sunset. "Since my sister died." The room seemed to lose warmth. Clara wanted to ask about Hannah, about the locked door, about the grief that lived behind his quiet, but the ledger pulled her gaze back down. Near the bottom of the page, beneath a list of old feed invoices and equipment charges, one line had been written in a different slant, newer ink pressed hard into the paper. Clara's breath caught. Caleb saw her face change. "What is it?" She touched the line with one finger, but the name blurred before she could make sense of it. Samuel Whitaker. 8 months old and already entered into a debt record like a calf, a wagon, a field tool, something that could be claimed later if the right man held the right paper. Clara pulled Sammy closer against her side, though he was not in the room. Her voice came out thin but steady. "Caleb," she said, "Silas did not only mean to sell me." Caleb did not speak for a long moment after Clara said Silas had meant to sell more than her. The office seemed too small for the silence that followed. Outside, the wind moved across the pasture and pressed softly against the glass, but inside the room every sound had sharpened. The faint tick of the wall clock, the rustle of ledger paper beneath Clara's fingertips, the slow breath Caleb drew as he stared at the name Samuel Whitaker written in black ink where no child's name should ever have been. His hand closed around the edge of the desk, not hard enough to break it, only hard enough to show that something in him had gone very still. "Let me see the page before that," he said. Clara turned it carefully. Her own hands were steadier now, not because she was calm, but because fear had become useful. She had lived too long with fear not to know when it could be turned into a lamp. The entries showed feed, wire, seed, freight, a saddle repair, then a line marked guardianship consideration. Clara read it twice before the meaning reached her. Guardianship, she whispered. He was not waiting for Sammy to grow old enough to work. Caleb's eyes lifted to hers. He was preparing to take him. The words did not shout. They did not need to. Clara felt them strike the room like a door closing. She stepped back, one hand going to the front of her dress as if Sammy were still tucked against her heart. He was upstairs with Mrs. Ames, the housekeeper Caleb had brought from a neighboring ranch 3 days before to help with laundry and meals, but suddenly the distance between the office and that bedroom felt like miles. "No," Clara said. It was not a denial. It was a vow. Caleb reached for his hat on the desk. "I will ride into town." Clara caught his sleeve before he could pass. The gesture surprised both of them. Her fingers rested against worn cotton, barely touching, yet he stopped at once as if she had put a gate across the road. "And do what?" she asked. "Ask Silas what paper he thinks he holds." "Ask?" Her voice trembled, then steadied. "A man like Silas does not answer questions. He files them away until he can use them against you." Caleb's mouth tightened. "I will not let him near the boy." "I believe you." Clara released his sleeve slowly. "But if you ride in with anger, he will make the town look at your temper instead of his books. He will say you tore a lawful contract. He will say you took me from a public proceeding. He will say whatever makes the sheriff listen to him first." Caleb looked toward the window, and Clara saw the battle in him, the urge to act, to stand between danger and the people under his roof, fighting against the discipline that had made him safe until now. "Then what do you want to do?" he asked. The question nearly undid her. No one had asked her that at the auction. No one had asked her when her husband's debts were counted. No one had asked her when Silas put her son's name into a ledger. Caleb was asking now, and the weight of that choice settled on her shoulders like something frightening and holy. Clara turned back to the desk. "I want every book you have that bears Silas Hargrove's name. Every note, every receipt, every payment, every letter. If he hid Sammy in your accounts, he has hidden other things too." Caleb studied her face. "That is a lot of paper." "Good," she said. "Paper is where men like him feel safe." By evening, the office floor was covered in neat stacks. Clara sat at the desk with a pencil behind one ear, Sammy asleep in the cradle near the fireplace just outside the open door. Caleb brought in boxes from the barn, from the pantry shelf, from the locked cabinet beneath the stairs. Amos Reed came with a bundle of old freight receipts tied in twine. Even Ben and Eli searched the tack room for stray bills. Clara sorted everything by year, then by hand, then by ink color. Numbers did not frighten her the way men did. Numbers could lie, but they left tracks. Just after supper, she found the first proof. Silas had charged Caleb interest on a loan 2 months before Caleb had signed it. Then another, a delivery fee on wire that had never arrived. Then a third, a court filing in Clara's late husband's name dated 3 days after his burial. Caleb stood behind her chair, not close enough to crowd her, but near enough that she could feel the heat of his presence in the room. "He did this to both of us," Clara said. "No," Caleb replied. "He did this to half the county. We are only the ones who found the thread." She looked up then. "Why did you borrow from him after Hannah died?" The name hung between them. Caleb's gaze went to the hallway ceiling, toward the upper room with the locked door. For a moment Clara thought he would not answer. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat, his hat turning slowly in his hands. "Hannah was my younger sister. She was 19. Laughed too loud, trusted too easy, and believed every broken thing could be mended if a person had enough patience. His voice stayed even, but Clara heard the carefulness in it, the way each word had to pass through pain before it reached the air. Our father left debts behind. Not large ones, but enough for Silas to put his hand on our land. I rode north for cattle money. I was gone 6 weeks. When I came back, Hannah had signed herself into service at the Hargrove house to keep this ranch from being taken. Clara's pencil stilled. Caleb looked down at his hat. She thought she was helping me. She thought she could endure anything for 6 weeks. By the time I returned, she was sick from exhaustion and pride. She would not tell me how bad it was until she could not climb the stairs without holding the wall. Clara's eyes filled, but the tears did not fall. She understood pride that kept pain quiet. She understood loving someone enough to bargain with yourself until the bargain ruined you. Is that why the room is locked? Caleb nodded once. It was hers. I kept it the way she left it because opening the door felt like admitting she was never coming back. Clara looked toward the hallway where the shadows had deepened. The ranch no longer seemed cold because it was empty. It was cold because one room had been holding winter for years. From the cradle, Sammy sighed in his sleep, and Caleb's eyes moved to him with an ache he did not try to hide. Clara understood the truth then. Caleb had not stepped forward at the auction because he wanted to be a hero. He had stepped forward because once he had been too late. She turned back to the ledger and touched Sammy's name with the end of her pencil. Then we will not be late this time. Caleb met her eyes. Something passed between them, not romance, not yet, but trust shaped like a shared burden. No, he said. We will not. Clara gathered the papers into a clean stack, tied them with twine, and slid them into her valise as carefully as if they were blankets for her child. Tomorrow, she said, I go back to town. Caleb's shoulders stiffened. Not alone. Not hidden behind you either. The words came out softer than she expected, but stronger too. You saved my body that day, Caleb. Let me save my son's name. He looked at her for a long time, then gave a slow nod. Upstairs, beyond the dark landing, the locked room waited. Downstairs, the proof of Silas Hargrove's greed lay bundled in Clara's bag. And for the first time since she had stood on the auction block, Clara did not feel like a woman being carried away from danger. She felt like a mother walking toward it with her eyes open. The morning Clara returned to Redemption Creek, the sky was the color of pewter and the wind moved low over the prairie as if it were trying to push her back. She sat on the wagon bench with Sammy wrapped against her chest, the bundle of ledgers and receipts tucked beneath her feet in the same worn valise she had carried from the auction block. Caleb drove beside her, quiet as ever, his hat brim shading his eyes, while Amos Reed rode 20 yards behind them with Mrs. Ames in a second wagon. It had been Caleb's idea to bring witnesses, not weapons. Clara had agreed because witnesses could speak after fear had passed, and she was done letting fear have the only voice. No one said much during the 12-mile ride. The wheels creaked over ruts. The horses breathed clouds into the cool air. Sammy slept with one fist pressed against Clara's collar, trusting her to carry him through a world that had already put his name in a debt book before he could say it himself. When the first roofs of town appeared, Clara's hands tightened around the edge of the blanket. Caleb noticed, but did not speak. He only slowed the team so the wagon would not jolt. That small kindness nearly hurt more than the memory of cruelty. The street looked the same as it had on auction day, the mercantile with its striped awning, the saloon doors swinging in the wind, the bank standing square and clean at the corner as though respectability could be painted white. But the people looked different to Clara now. Or perhaps she did. Heads turned as the wagon rolled in. Men stepped out from the livery. Women paused with baskets on their arms. A boy stopped sweeping the boardwalk and stared until his mother pulled him behind her skirts. No one called out. No one welcomed her. The silence was waiting to see whether she had come back as a victim or trouble. Caleb drew the horses to a stop outside the town hall, a plain wooden building beside the sheriff's office. A notice had been nailed to the door, public hearing regarding guardianship and debt claims. Clara read the words twice and a cold line moved down her spine. Silas had not waited for them to challenge him. He had already moved first. Caleb followed her gaze. His voice was low. We can turn around. Clara looked at Sammy, then at the valise. That is what he expects. Inside the town hall, benches had been arranged in rows, and nearly half the town had gathered. Silas Hargrove stood at the front with his ledger open on the table, dressed in a dark suit that made him look more like a judge than a banker. Sheriff Lyle Maddox sat beside him, uneasy beneath his gray mustache. Otis Bell leaned near the stove with his arms crossed, wearing a smile that seemed practiced in the mirror. When Clara entered, whispers stirred like dry leaves. She felt them touch her dress, her face, the roundness of her body, the baby in her arms, every piece of her that strangers had once believed they could measure and price. Caleb stepped through the doorway behind her, and the whispers thinned, but Clara did not let herself lean into his shadow. She walked to the front bench and sat with Sammy on her lap. The valise rested at her feet. Silas watched the movement with pale satisfaction. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, all courtesy sharp and thin. "How fortunate you chose to attend. I was prepared to send formal notice to Mr. Mercer's ranch." Clara looked at the room before answering. Faces she remembered from the auction looked back at her and quickly away. "You put my son's name in a ledger," she said. "I came to hear why." A stir moved through the benches. Silas lifted one hand, calm and smooth. "The matter concerns the welfare of the child. Nothing more. Given Mrs. Whitaker's recent instability, public debt, and questionable lodging arrangements, I have petitioned for temporary guardianship review until proper care can be assured." Clara felt the words try to become a rope around her throat. Instability. Welfare. Proper care. Again, clean words for dirty work. Caleb's hand shifted at his side, but Clara lifted one finger against the edge of the bench, and he went still. She had asked him not to stand in front of her unless the room gave him no choice. Silas turned a page in his ledger. Furthermore, Mr. Mercer interfered with a lawful debt transfer, destroyed documentation, and removed Mrs. Whitaker before outstanding obligations could be fully assessed. Sheriff Maddox frowned. "Silas, you told me the debt was settled." "The primary debt, yes. Not the associated obligations." Otis Bell pushed himself from the stove. "A woman who gets sold one day and hidden at a bachelor's ranch the next should not be the one deciding what is proper for a child." The room went painfully quiet. Clara's cheeks warmed, not with shame this time, but with the effort it took not to look down. Sammy stirred, blinking sleepily at the strange faces. She kissed his forehead and rose. Caleb rose behind her, but she did not turn. "Sit," she said softly. The single word carried only to him, but he obeyed it. Silas's mouth tightened. Otis gave a small laugh. "You hear that? She gives orders now." Clara picked up the valise and set it on the table. Its old leather was cracked, the brass latch bent, but inside it sat a week of truth tied in careful stacks. She opened it slowly. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "you filed for guardianship because you claim I cannot provide proper care for my son." "That is correct. And because you claim there are unpaid obligations attached to my late husband's estate." "Also correct." Clara lifted the first paper, but Silas stepped closer, his cane tapping once against the floor. "Before you begin performing grief for the room, Mrs. Whitaker, I would remind everyone present that your word is not a ledger." Otis smiled wider. "What is the word of a sold woman worth?" The question landed exactly where he meant it to. Clara felt the whole town inhale. For one heartbeat, she was back on the block, dust in her mouth, Sammy in her arms, the auctioneer's voice turning her life into numbers. Then she looked at Caleb. He sat very still, his jaw tight, his eyes on her, not rescuing, not commanding, simply believing she would stand. Clara turned back to Otis and Silas. Her fingers stopped trembling. She opened the ledger to the marked page and laid it flat before the sheriff. "More than the word of a thief," she said. The room did not erupt when Clara called Silas Hargrove a thief. It went quieter, which was worse for him. A shouting crowd could be steered. A silent one had begun to listen. Sheriff Maddox leaned forward, his thick fingers resting on the edge of the table, while Silas's polished expression held for one breath too long before it cracked at the corner. "That is a serious accusation, Mrs. Whitaker," the sheriff said. Clara nodded once. Yes, sir. That is why I brought serious proof. She turned the first ledger around so the sheriff could read the columns. Her voice was not loud, but it carried because every person in the room had leaned toward it. This entry says my late husband owed Silas Hargrove $38 for seed and freight in March. But this freight receipt, signed by Mr. Dale at the station, says no shipment arrived for the Whitaker place in March. The tracks were washed out for 9 days. No freight came through. A murmur passed over the benches. Mr. Dale, the station clerk, rose halfway from the back row, his cap twisting in his hands. That is true, Sheriff. I remember the washout. We had flour stacked clear to the ceiling waiting on the rails. Silas's cane tapped once. Clerical error. Clara lifted the next paper. This one charges Caleb Mercer interest on a loan 2 months before he signed for it. Caleb remained seated, but every eye cut toward him and then back to Silas. Clara did not look at him. If she leaned on his name, Silas would say this was Mercer's fight. It was. Not anymore. This court filing, Clara continued, laying down a third page, claims my husband's estate was reviewed on June 12th. My husband was buried on June 9th. I was not notified. No judge signed the bottom. Only Mr. Hargrove did. Sheriff Maddox took the paper, held it to the window light, and his brows drew together. Silas. The banker's smile thinned. Frontier paperwork is rarely as tidy as Boston ladies might wish it to be. Clara felt the insult aimed at her softness, her education, her body, her Eastern past, all the things men like him thought could be used to make a woman small. She let it pass over her. A river did not argue with a stone. It wore it down. I am not from Boston, she said. And arithmetic is the same in Montana. A few people in the room shifted. Someone near the front gave a quiet sound that might have been agreement. Silas's gaze sharpened. You were a desperate widow with unpaid debts. Desperate people often misunderstand what they sign. I did not sign this. Clara placed the guardianship paper on the table. My son's name appears here beside a fee dated before the auction. Before you told the town there was a public debt proceeding. Before you claimed you were only settling accounts. You had already marked him for transfer. The word transfer soured in her mouth, but she forced herself to say it clearly. The sheriff looked at the paper, then at Sammy, who sat in Mrs. Ames's lap near the side wall chewing quietly on a corner of his blanket. A baby cannot be party to a labor note, he said slowly. Not lawfully. Silas's face changed then, not dramatically, not enough for a fool to notice, but Clara had spent too many years reading men by the tightening of a jaw and the stillness of a hand. He was no longer amused. Otis Bell pushed away from the stove. This is a lot of fuss over a woman who would have been better off under proper supervision. Clara turned toward him. The old fear rose, but now it had nowhere to rule. Proper supervision is what men call a cage when they want credit for building it. The words landed harder than she expected. A woman in the second row lowered her eyes, then lifted them again. Mrs. Pike from the boarding house stood with her hands folded at her waist. Sheriff, she said, Mrs. Whitaker had a locked room in my house that night. Mr. Mercer slept at the stairs and did not cross her door. If anyone calls that improper, they were not there. Another woman stood near the aisle, Mrs. Dale from the station. And I saw Silas's clerk posting the auction notice before the final estate paper was filed. My husband said it was strange, but we did not want trouble. The first admission loosened the second. The second loosened a third. Amos Reed spoke of false feed charges on the Mercer account. Ben Carter admitted he had delivered wire the bank later claimed never arrived. An older farmer raised a shaking hand and said his own note had grown by $10 after he had paid it. The room began to change shape around Silas Hargrove. He had entered it as the man with the ledger. Now the ledger was turning its face toward him. Silas reached for the guardianship paper. Enough. These documents are bank property. Clara moved to cover it, but Otis stepped in faster, his hand closing around the edge of the table. Caleb rose then. He did not draw his revolver. He did not touch Otis. He simply stood between the man and Clara with the full quiet weight of himself, close enough that Otis had to look up. Touch her papers, Caleb said, and every man here will know what kind of coward needs to silence a mother. Otis's face flushed. For a moment, the room held its breath again. Then Sheriff Maddox stood. Step back, Belle. Otis looked around, searching for support, but found only people watching him with new eyes. He stepped back. Silas straightened his cuffs, trying to gather dignity from cloth. Sheriff, you're allowing public emotion to override financial law. Maddox took the ledger from the table and closed it with a heavy palm. No, Silas. I am allowing numbers to speak plain. He turned to his deputy near the door. Bring the bank seal book and Hargrove's filed notes from the office. All of them. Silas went pale. Clara felt the last tremor leave her hands. The deputy returned within minutes, and the comparison did not take long. Different ink. Different dates. Repeated fees. Names entered where they had no lawful place. When the sheriff finally looked up, the room already knew. Silas Hargrove, he said, you will come with me until the county judge reviews these charges. Silas's cane slipped against the floorboards with a dry scrape. He did not fight. Men like him rarely did when the room no longer believed their suit. As the sheriff led him out, Silas's eyes found Clara. There was hatred there, but it no longer looked large. It looked cornered. Otis slipped toward the side door, only to find Amos Reed blocking the way with both hands resting calmly on his belt. Town Road is that way, Amos said, nodding toward the front. Best use it while folks are still polite. A few people laughed softly, not with cruelty, but with the relief of seeing a bully made ordinary. Clara gathered the papers with careful hands. She expected to feel triumph, but what came instead was exhaustion so deep she nearly swayed. Caleb was beside her at once, not touching, only close enough to catch her if she chose it. She did not. She stood on her own. Mrs. Ames brought Sammy to her, and Clara took him, pressing her cheek to his soft hair. You are still yours, she whispered. You were always yours. As people began to file out, one of the town women approached with a hesitant smile. Mrs. Mercer, if you need anything while the judge is here. Clara looked up. Caleb went still beside her. The name hung in the air, warm and dangerous, a kindness that could still become a cage if accepted too soon. Clara adjusted Sammy on her hip and met the woman's eyes without anger. Not yet, she said. Not until I choose it. Caleb's mouth softened at the edge, almost a smile, but not quite. Outside, the clouds had broken, and sunlight stretched across the street where the auction block still stood empty. Clara stepped into that light carrying her son, her papers, and her own name. By the time the county judge arrived 3 days later, Redemption Creek had already begun changing its mind about Silas Hargrove. Men who had once crossed the street to avoid questioning him now stood outside the sheriff's office with folded receipts in their hands. Women who had watched Clara from behind curtains came forward with notes, canceled bills, and quiet stories of fees that had appeared after payments were made. The hearing was held in the same town hall where Silas had tried to take Sammy, but this time he sat at the front without his cane, without his ledger, and without the easy smile that had made cruelty look respectable. Sheriff Maddox placed the bank records, the guardianship paper, and Clara's marked account books before Judge Whitcomb, a narrow man with silver spectacles and a voice dry as kindling. The judge read for nearly an hour while the room held its breath. Clara sat with Sammy on her lap, Caleb beside her but not touching, close enough that she could feel his steadiness and far enough that every person present could see she had come under her own power. When Judge Whitcomb finally looked up, he did not look at Caleb. He looked at Clara. Mrs. Whitaker, the debt claimed against your husband's estate was inflated, improperly filed, and in several places unlawfully altered. The guardianship petition concerning your son is dismissed with prejudice. No man in this county holds claim over Samuel Whitaker, his labor, his custody, or his future. Clara closed her eyes for one breath. Sammy tugged at the ribbon on her collar, unaware that a door had just opened above his life. The judge continued, turning his gaze to Silas. Mr. Hargrove, your ledgers will be seized for county review. You are removed from authority over the bank pending trial. Restitution will be calculated for all injured parties. Until then, you will remain in Sheriff Maddox's custody." Silas stood as if dignity could still be worn like a coat. "Your Honor, this town will regret humiliating the only man who understood credit." Judge Whitcomb removed his spectacles. "No, Mr. Hargrove. They may regret trusting you with it." The sheriff led Silas through the aisle, and this time no one stepped aside with respect. They moved because the law required passage, but their eyes stayed level. Otis Bell was ordered to leave the county after testimony showed he had agreed to profit from Silas's false transfer papers. He rode out before sundown with his saddlebags half-packed and no one at the saloon lifting a glass to wish him luck. The auction block was taken down the next morning. Amos Reed brought a pry bar, Ben and Eli pulled the boards loose, and men from town helped stack the lumber behind the livery. No speeches were made. The sound of nails coming free was enough. Clara watched from the boardwalk with Sammy in her arms, the old valise at her feet, and for the first time since she had entered Redemption Creek as a widow with no defense, she did not feel the street looking through her. She felt it looking at her. Mrs. Pike came to stand beside her and quietly pressed a folded paper into her hand. It was a receipt showing that the boarding house room had been paid in full, then marked forgiven. "For the night you should have been welcomed better," the older woman said. Clara's throat tightened. "Thank you." "No," Mrs. Pike said, glancing toward the place where the auction block had stood. "Thank you." That afternoon, Caleb drove Clara and Sammy back to Mercer Ranch. The sky had cleared after days of gray, and the prairie rolled gold beneath the late light. Neither of them spoke much until the house came into view, its porch washed in sunset, the windmill turning slow beside the well. Clara expected Caleb to pull up at the front steps. Instead, he stopped near the gate and handed her a small envelope. Inside were her legal papers, a copy of the judge's ruling, $30 in cash, and a stage ticket good for passage east or west. Clara looked at the ticket, then at him. Caleb kept his hands on the reins. "A home is not a cage," he said. "Not mine. Not ever. If you want to leave tomorrow, I will take you to the stage myself. If you want wages for the work you have done, you will have them. If you want to stay until spring and decide then, that is yours too." Clara stared down at the ticket until the print blurred. Once, paper had nearly taken her child. Now paper was being used to give her a choice. She folded the envelope carefully and placed it in her valise. "I spent a long time staying places because I had nowhere else to go," she said. Caleb looked at the road ahead, his jaw still, as though he had prepared himself for whatever came next. Clara turned toward the ranch house, where Mrs. Ames had lit the kitchen lamp and warm gold shone through the window. Sammy bounced once on her lap and reached toward the porch as if he already knew it. "This time," Clara said, "I am staying because I want to." Caleb's breath caught, barely, but she heard it. He climbed down, came around to her side of the wagon, and offered his hand palm up. She took it because she chose to, and when her boots touched the ground, he did not let go until she loosened her fingers first. A week later, on Sunday after church, with half of Redemption Creek gathered beneath the cottonwoods behind the white clapboard chapel, Caleb Mercer stood beside Clara while Sammy slept in Mrs. Ames's arms. He had asked Clara privately before, at the kitchen table with coffee cooling between them, and she had said yes there first, where no one could mistake her answer for pressure or gratitude. But Caleb said the town owed her a public truth after giving her public shame. So he faced them all, hat in his hands, his voice steady enough to carry beyond the fence. "I did not buy Clara Whitaker. I did not save her so she would owe me her heart. She belongs to herself, as every woman should. I am standing here because I choose her, and because she has chosen me freely. If she will have me beside her, I will spend my life honoring that choice." Clara felt tears rise, but they did not fall. She stepped forward before anyone could answer for her. "I was brought before this town once as a debt," she said. "Today I stand here as a woman, a mother, and a free soul. I choose Caleb Mercer. I choose this life. Not because I was claimed, but because I am loved with respect." The wedding was small, honest, and sunlit. No grand dress, no polished silver, no orchestra. Clara wore a cream calico gown Mrs. Pike helped alter, and Caleb wore his best dark coat with a new ribbon on his hat. Sammy woke during the vows and laughed at the church bell, making half the congregation laugh with him. When Caleb slid the plain gold ring onto Clara's finger, his hand trembled for the first time since she had known him. She loved him more for it. 1 year later, Mercer Ranch no longer felt like a house built around a locked door. Hannah's room had been opened in the spring. Clara had washed the curtains, Caleb had carried out the trunks, and together they turned it into a small room with books, slates, quilts, and a cradle for any child who came through their door needing rest. The county completed its review of Silas Hargrove's records, and money was returned to families who had thought they would never see justice. Silas was sentenced to prison and barred from holding any financial office again. The old auction lumber became a fence around Clara's garden, not hidden, not celebrated, but remade into something that held life instead of shame. By autumn, the ranch kitchen smelled of bread every morning, coffee by sunrise, stew by evening, and sometimes apple cake when Mrs. Pike came to visit. Clara kept the accounts in a clean ledger with her own name written on the first page, Clara Whitaker Mercer, ranch partner. Caleb never corrected anyone who called it his ranch, but he always said, ours, before the sentence ended. On quiet evenings, they sat on the porch while Sammy toddled between them on sturdy legs, chasing fireflies beneath the cottonwoods. The old valise rested on a shelf by the door, polished now, not because Clara needed to run, but because she wanted to remember the woman who had carried it when she had nothing else. Inside it lay the judge's ruling, the stage ticket she never used, and the torn scrap of a false contract Caleb had picked from the dust. Not as a wound. As proof. The sun sank over the pasture, turning the grass to copper and the windows to flame. Caleb reached for Clara's hand and waited, as he always did, for her to meet him halfway. She did. From inside the bright ranch house came Mrs. Ames's voice calling them to supper, Sammy's laughter, and the soft glow of an oil lamp set in the window like a promise. Clara had once stood before a town that called her a burden, a debt, a thing to be transferred. Now she stood on her own porch, with her own key in her pocket, her son safe, her name honored, and the man beside her loving her without chains. She had not been owned. She had been respected, chosen, and finally allowed to become a home of her own.